My name is Eleanor Collins, and at 72 years old, I have quite a story to tell. Life wasn't always the bed of roses you see in those perfect British films. I grew up in a small coastal village in Devon during the post-war years of the 1950s, when Britain was still recovering from rationing and hardship. Sometimes I wonder if God had a plan for me when He allowed everything to happen as it did. What I do know is that my story might seem heartbreaking, but it also has its beauty, like those stubborn wildflowers that somehow grow through cracks in the pavement. It was 1969, and I was 16 years old, living in our modest stone cottage near the cliffs, where the constant sound of waves crashing against rocks became the soundtrack of my childhood. Before I continue, I have a special request for you. Subscribe to the channel now and leave your like. It makes all the difference in helping more people hear our stories. Our home stood adjacent to my father's bookshop, Hastings Books and Antiquities. Every morning, the aroma of the strong English breakfast tea my mother prepared would mingle with the distinctive scent of old paper and leather bindings. The bookshop wasn't particularly profitable, but it gave my father, Henry Hastings, a certain standing in our small community. He was known as a learned man, though, looking back, his knowledge was superficial at best, gathered from the spines of books he rarely opened. Our cottage was simple. A small sitting room made even smaller by the oversized dining table, 2 bedrooms, and a tiny attached dwelling in the back where my grandmother lived. The kitchen was Grandmother Martha's domain, though Mother tried her best to claim some authority there. I would rise before dawn to help with chores before walking the mile to school. Today's children wouldn't believe it, but in those days, girls were raised knowing their place was taking care of the home. After school and lunch, I would go to help at the bookshop. My brother Thomas, 2 years my senior, was already working there full-time. He had left school at 14 to help Father, who frequently traveled to estate sales and auctions in neighboring counties looking for valuable books. Thomas was clever. He could calculate figures in his head better than anyone and manage the register when Father was away. I would dust and organize the shelves, occasionally helping customers find what they needed. My younger brothers, William and Edward, weren't allowed anywhere near the shop. They were wild boys who touched everything with dirty hands and damaged precious merchandise. These two are only good for causing losses, Father would complain. So they stayed at home helping Mother with simple tasks. The bookshop, which locals simply called Hastings, was always bustling with activity. I remember vividly the tinkling of the little brass bell whenever someone entered. Ding, ding. And there I'd go in my faded blue pinafore to attend to customers. "A half-pound of stationery, please." Or, "Do you have the latest Christie novel?" It was like this all day, a constant parade of village characters, each with their own peculiar requests and stories. What marked me most was the smell, a unique mixture of leather-bound books, India ink, pipe tobacco, and the faint scent of sea salt that permeated everything in our coastal village. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still smell it, transporting me instantly back to those days. It's curious how memory works, isn't it? But life wasn't all roses at home. The rules were stricter than iron posts. My father, a serious man, hardly spoke, but when he did open his mouth, it was to give orders. "Eleanor, fix that skirt!" "Thomas, stop your laziness and help with those new deliveries." We obeyed instantly. In those times, no child dared talk back to their parents, especially not to a father like mine. My mother, poor woman, lived caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. She wanted to protect us, but she couldn't contradict Father. How many times I had swallowed my tears, pretending everything was fine. It was sad. but that's how things worked back then. And Grandmother Martha. Oh, she was a tiny figure, but with a tongue sharper than a razor blade. She was always grumbling around corners, but deep down she had a soft heart. With her, I learned to make that Devon cream tea that still brings comfort to my soul on difficult days. Looking back, life was hard but simple. We didn't have much, but we also didn't know anything different. It was all about work, prayer, and respecting your elders. In those days, I couldn't imagine what fate had in store for me. I was just a girl full of dreams, thinking the world ended at the village square and there cliffs beyond. If there's one thing that stays with me after all these years, it's the family dinners at our home. Every day at 7 o'clock sharp, the entire family gathered around that old oak table that creaked like a grumpy old woman. It was sacred. It could be pouring with rain outside, but no one dared miss dinner. The table stood imposingly in our narrow sitting room, covered with a lace tablecloth that Grandmother Martha had made years ago. Father always sat at the head like a king on his throne. To his right was Mother, always with her head slightly bowed, serving everyone without saying a word. My brothers and I would squeeze together on the other side, trying not to make a sound, not even with our breathing. The grandparents completed the picture, one on each end of the table. Oh, if that table could talk, what secrets would it tell? How many disapproving looks, swallowed sighs, and unspoken words it must have witnessed. Silence was the golden rule. At the table of educated people, one doesn't open their mouth to speak, only to eat, Father would say. God help whoever disobeyed. The leather belt hanging behind the kitchen door was always within reach, a constant reminder of what could happen. In those moments, I would think, are all families like this? Did God make things to be this way? Because while it was supposed to be a blessing, sometimes it felt more like a trial. No one prepared me for the changes in my body. Around 16, I began to notice things were different. It was as if my own body had become a stranger to me. First came the changes in my chest, suddenly developing and causing me unbearable embarrassment. I hid behind loose blouses, mortified. By the way, some of the village men would look at me now. Grandmother Martha was the one who noticed. One day she approached me and whispered that it was time I wore a proper brassiere. The shame I felt. But there was no alternative. I went with Grandmother to Mrs. Blackwood's notion shop, where I was measured behind a screen, feeling as if I were committing some terrible sin just by being there. Those undergarments were torture. They itched like straw and constricted like a corset. I felt completely bound up, but there was no choice in the matter. Grandmother Martha kept repeating that if I didn't wear one, my breasts would end up sagging, like those gypsy women who camp by the river. I had no idea what she meant exactly, but the thought terrified me, so I endured the discomfort and resigned myself to this new prison. And then came menstruation. Lord, what a fright that was. One morning I woke up with blood on my nightgown and thought I was dying. I ran crying to my mother, believing I had some terrible disease. My poor mother turned more crimson than I was and explained, all flustered, that it was normal, that every woman went through it. But the details, nothing. Everything was very vague. That's it, Eleanor. You're a young lady now. Looking back, I suppose I was actually lucky. Many girls my age didn't even get that basic explanation. Some mothers simply handed their daughters some rags and sent them off to figure things out for themselves. In those days, matters related to the body and menstruation were considered taboo. Nobody dared speak about them openly. At school, there was constant whispering. Girls would gather during breaks to exchange information, always afraid someone might overhear. Has it started for you yet? How do you keep from staining your clothes? Questions whispered by Jane, the butcher's daughter, or Catherine from the post office. Everyone wanted to be friends with Sophia, whose mother was different from all the others in our village. They seemed to talk about everything openly in her house. Sophia would come to school full of information, telling us things that made our cheeks burn red. To tell the truth, I was dying of envy for that girl. She and half the school. And the boys? Oh, those rascals were merciless. They would tease and provoke, making jokes if a girl seemed in a bad mood. Must be her time of the month. We would die of embarrassment but couldn't say anything back. I remember once having terrible cramps at school. I remained hunched over at my desk, sweating cold, afraid to stand up in case I had stained my skirt. Miss Richardson, the English teacher, asked if I was feeling unwell. I nearly died of embarrassment and just shook my head, saying it was nothing. The worst part was that we knew nothing about our own bodies. It was all mystery, all sin. If someone asked where babies came from, the answer was always the same. The stork brings them. And believe it or not, we believed it. At least for a while. Once I found a hidden book in the library that talked about the human body. I felt like I was reading something forbidden, turning each page while looking around to make sure no one was watching me. In those days, that's how it was. We discovered things little by little, always in fear, always in hiding. It was like walking in darkness, groping, stumbling, never knowing exactly what was happening. And dreams. Around that time, I started having strange dreams that left me confused. I would wake up with my heart pounding, not understanding what had happened. It was during this tumultuous time that I first noticed Charles Blackwood. He wasn't like the other men in our village, tall, well-dressed, and considerably older at 46. As the largest landowner in the county, he would occasionally visit Father's bookshop looking for rare first editions to add to his collection. There was something different about the way he looked at me, something that made me both uncomfortable and curious at the same time. I recall one afternoon when I was arranging books on the top shelf, stretching on tiptoe to reach. "Allow me, Miss Hastings," he said, standing so close I could smell his expensive cologne and the faint whisper of whiskey on his breath. His hand brushed mine as he took the book, and I felt my face flush crimson. I didn't understand then what that feeling was. A mixture of fear and something else I couldn't name. Mr. Blackwood began visiting the shop more frequently, always when Father was present, always perfectly polite. He would bring small gifts, a box of quality stationery for the shop, though he would insist I keep it for my own use, or once a beautiful blue ribbon for my hair that matched my eyes. Father seemed pleased by these attentions. I noticed how he would straighten up, become more deferential when Mr. Blackwood entered. "A valuable connection," I overheard him telling Mother one evening. "He has influence throughout the county." Later, I would understand that Father was deeply in debt. The bookshop was failing, and Mr. Blackwood had been buying more books than he could possibly want, paying far above their value. I was 16, naive, still believing that kindness came without strings attached. During this same period, I met James at the Spring Village Fair. He was working with the traveling carnival that visited annually. A young man of 19 with sun-darkened skin and a laugh that made something inside me brighten. His hands were rough from labor, but gentle when he helped me onto the small Ferris wheel. "Don't be scared," he said, his accent different from ours, musical almost. "I won't let anything happen to you." For those few minutes suspended above the village, the wind in my hair and James's warm presence beside me, I felt a freedom I'd never known. It was innocent, our relationship. A few stolen conversations when I could slip away from grandmother's. watchful eye, a brush of hands when passing, a flower secretly pressed into my palm. But in our small village, even such innocent connections didn't go unnoticed. Word reached my father that I had been seen talking to that carnival boy. The reaction was swift and terrible. I was forbidden from leaving the house except for school and church, always accompanied by Thomas or grandmother. "No daughter of mine will disgrace this family by associating with vagrants," Father thundered, the belt making its appearance that night. The bruises on my legs took weeks to fade, but the determination in my heart only grew stronger. James found ways to send me notes through a sympathetic schoolmate, small scraps of paper with pressed wildflowers or brief messages. "Meet me by the old oak past the churchyard, Sunday after service." I knew I shouldn't go, knew the consequences would be severe if discovered, but at 16, the heart rarely listens to reason. That Sunday after church, I complained of a headache and asked to walk home alone to get some air. Grandmother looked suspicious but allowed it. My heart pounding like a drum, I slipped behind the churchyard to the ancient oak where James waited. "Eleanor," he breathed, as if my name was a prayer. He spoke of leaving soon with the carnival, moving on to the next town. But he had a plan. "Come with me," he said, eyes bright with possibilities I couldn't even imagine. "We could travel, see places beyond this village. I have savings. Not much, but enough to start." I was terrified and exhilarated all at once. We made plans, whispered promises, sealed with my first kiss. Awkward, sweet, forbidden. I returned home in a daze, my lips tingling, my future suddenly full of possibilities outside the narrow confines of my father's house. 2 more secret meetings followed, each more desperate than the last, as the day of the carnival's departure grew closer. James spoke of marriage, of a small cottage someday when we had saved enough. I believed him completely, with the absolute faith of first love. The last time we met, our goodbye was more passionate than before. His hands strayed, beyond what was proper, and in my innocence and emotional state. I didn't stop him. The sin that my father and the village vicar had warned about for so long happened there, beneath the sheltering branches of the ancient oak, on a bed of moss and fallen leaves. It was brief, painful, and nothing like the romantic notions I had gleaned from smuggled romance novels. Afterward, I cried, not understanding the storm of emotions. James held me, wiping my tears, promising everything would be all right when he returned for me in 2 weeks' time. I waited at home, counting days, planning what few possessions I would take when James returned. But 2 weeks passed, then 3, with no word. The carnival had moved on, and James with it. I tried to convince myself there must be some explanation. Perhaps he was ill or had been delayed somehow. The truth was simpler and more brutal. He had gotten what he wanted and moved on, like the traveling carnival itself. Meanwhile, my body betrayed me. The monthly bleeding that had become a dreaded regularity failed to appear. At first, I told myself it was stress, the excitement of planning my escape. But as weeks passed and morning sickness gripped me, the terrible reality became undeniable. I was carrying James's child, unmarried, barely 16, in a village where such a transgression was the ultimate disgrace. I hid my condition as long as possible, wearing looser dresses, claiming illness when the morning sickness became too obvious to hide. But mothers and grandmothers have a sixth sense about such things. One evening, as I helped prepare dinner, overcome by the smell of cooking cabbage, I rushed outside to be violently ill. When I returned, pale and shaking, Grandmother, Martha, was waiting. Her eyes sharp as ever scanned me from head to toe. "You're with child," she stated flatly. Not a question, but a verdict. The room spun around me as I collapsed into a chair, unable to deny it any longer. What followed remains the most horrific night of my life. Father was told, his rage terrible. To behold. "Whore!" he screamed, striking me across the face. "You've brought shame upon this house," Mother wept quietly in the corner, offering no defense. The next morning, still bruised and red-eyed from a night of tears, I was summoned to Father's study. To my shock, Charles Blackwood sat there, looking grave but composed. What transpired in that room still haunts my nightmares. Father had made a bargain, my hand in marriage to Mr. Blackwood, in exchange for the cancellation of Father's substantial debts. "He's willing to take you despite your condition," Father said, as if this were a tremendous act of charity rather than the purchase of a human being. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend. "But I don't love him," I whispered, earning another harsh slap. Mr. Blackwood watched impassively, then spoke. "Love is a luxury, Miss Hastings. Security, respectability, these are what matter. I can provide both, despite your indiscretion." His eyes lingered on my still flat stomach in a way that made me feel ill. I had no choice in the matter. In our society, a girl of 16 had no rights against her father's will. The wedding was arranged with indecent haste, a quiet ceremony with only immediate family present. I wore not white, but a somber gray dress, more suited to a funeral than a wedding. In many ways, it was a funeral, the death of my dreams, my freedom, my youth. The vicar, informed of the urgency of the situation, performed the ceremony with obvious disapproval, emphasizing the vows of obedience with particular force. I spoke the words mechanically, feeling as if I were watching the entire scene from somewhere outside my body. And just like that, I became Mrs. Charles Blackwood, mistress of Thornfield Manor, and a prisoner in gilded chains. Life at Thornfield Manor was luxurious by village standards, but cold and oppressive. Charles, as I was now required to call him, kept me isolated from village life, claiming it was to protect my reputation. But I knew it was to hide his pregnant child bride from gossip. The house itself seemed to reject me, a sprawling Georgian edifice with too many rooms, too many shadows, and a staff who viewed me with barely disguised contempt. "The shopkeeper's daughter," they whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. My days passed in terrible loneliness. Charles was frequently away in London on business, leaving me under the watchful eye of Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper, who reported my every movement back to him and controlled who could visit me. Effectively, no one. As my belly grew, so did Charles's strange behavior. He became obsessed with the child, though not in the way a loving stepfather might be. "It will be removed from your influence as soon as it's born," he informed me over dinner one evening, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "A nurse will be engaged and the child will be raised properly, without the taint of its origins." When I protested, his hand slammed down on the table with such force that the crystal glasses jumped. "You seem to forget your position, Eleanor. You are here on my charity. The child, like everything in this house, including you, belongs to me." That night I cried myself to sleep, one hand protectively over my swollen belly, whispering promises to my unborn child that somehow I would protect it. The pregnancy progressed with difficulty. Perhaps it was the stress, the constant fear, or simply my young body struggling with the demands of carrying a child. But I was frequently ill. The local doctor, summoned by Mrs. Porter when I collapsed one morning, recommended complete bed rest for the final months. This confinement was both blessing and curse. free from Charles's cold presence but trapped in my ornate bedroom with only my thoughts and fears for company. The baby moved constantly, as if sharing my restlessness, my desire for escape. Pierre spoke to it constantly when alone, telling stories of a different life we might have had, singing lullabies Grandmother Martha had once sung to me. It was the only love I had left to give, the only love I received in that mausoleum of a house. I went into labor one stormy night in February, 1970, 2 months before the baby was due. The pain was excruciating, beyond anything I could have imagined. Mrs. Porter sent for the doctor and the midwife, but the storm had made the roads nearly impassable. By the time they arrived, I had been struggling for hours, growing weaker with each contraction. I remember the midwife's concerned face, the doctor's grim expression, the whispered conference they held by the window while thunder crashed outside. "The baby's turned wrong," I heard the midwife say, "and she's losing too much blood." What followed was a nightmare of pain, blood, and desperate prayers. I remember screaming until my voice gave out, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth from biting my lip, the feeling that my body was being torn apart, and then merciful darkness as I lost consciousness. When I awoke 3 days later, weak and hollow, Charles was sitting by my bed, his expression unreadable. "The child didn't survive," he said without preamble. "A boy. The doctor did everything possible." No comfort was offered, no shared grief. I turned my face to the wall, unable to bear the sight of him, unable to process the enormity of this new loss. They wouldn't let me see my son, wouldn't tell me where he was buried. Later, much later, I would come to suspect the truth, that my baby had been born alive but given away or sold, removed as Charles had promised. But at 17, broken in body and spirit, I lacked the strength to fight, to question, to do anything but surrender to the overwhelming grief that consumed me. The months that followed the loss of my baby were a blur of grief and emptiness. I became a ghost in that grand house, wandering the halls listlessly, neither eating nor sleeping properly. Charles seemed almost relieved by my withdrawn state, as if my shattered spirit made me more manageable, less likely to cause problems. The doctor prescribed laudanum for my female hysteria, as he called it, and Charles insisted I take it regularly. The medicine dulled everything, my thoughts, my feelings, the sharpness of my pain, leaving me floating in a hazy half-life where days and nights blended together. Looking back now, I recognize that this was the beginning of a deliberate effort to break me completely, to make me dependent and compliant. At 17, I had no resources, no allies, and nowhere to go even if I had possessed the strength to leave. Charles's true nature revealed itself once my body had healed enough to fulfill what he considered my wifely duties. The same man who had acted with such restraint during our courtship showed himself to be a cruel and selfish lover, caring nothing for my comfort or consent. I learned to retreat deep within myself during these encounters, to send my mind elsewhere. Back to the cliffs of Devon, to the sound of waves, to memories of better days. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in my detachment, sometimes becoming even more brutal in an attempt to force some reaction from me. When this failed, he would resort to other forms of control, limiting my access to money, screening my mail, restricting my movements within the house and grounds. "For your own protection," he would say, with that cold smile that never reached his eyes. The staff at Thornfield Manor, initially hostile, began to show small kindnesses as they witnessed my daily humiliations. Mrs. Porter would sometimes forget to add laudanum to my evening tea, giving me brief periods of clarity. The gardener's boy would secretly bring me wildflowers leaving them on the windowsill of the small sunroom where I spent my mornings. Even Charles's driver, Mr. Fleming, would occasionally take the long route when driving me to church on Sundays, the only outing I was permitted, just to give me a few extra minutes of fresh air and different scenery. These small acts of human decency were like drops of water in a vast desert of cruelty, keeping some tiny spark of my spirit alive when everything else seemed determined to extinguish it. I might have continued in this half-life indefinitely had it not been for a chance discovery in the Manor's library. One rainy afternoon, left alone while Charles attended business in London, I wandered into the grand room filled with books I had never been encouraged to touch. Running my fingers along leather spines, I discovered a loose panel in the ornate shelving. Behind it was a small cache of papers, correspondence between Charles and the doctor who had attended my delivery. The arrangement has been made as discussed. One letter read, "The infant has been placed with the family in question. A substantial donation to the orphanage has ensured their discretion." My hands trembled as I read further, confirming what my heart had always suspected. My son had not died, but had been taken from me, sold or given away as if he were a piece of unwanted furniture. Something broke in me that day, but something else awakened. For the first time since losing my child, I felt something beyond grief and fear, rage pure and cleansing as fire. I carefully replaced the letters exactly as I had found them, knowing that Charles must never suspect I had discovered his deception. That night, I did something I had not done in months. I refused the laudanum, pouring it into a potted plant when Mrs. Porter wasn't looking. The fog in my mind began to clear, and with it came the first glimmerings of a plan. I would need money, documents, information about where my son had been taken. Most of all, I would need patience and cunning, qualities I had never needed before but would now cultivate with the single-minded focus of a mother determined to find her child. I began small, testing the boundaries of my cage. I expressed interest in managing the household accounts, presenting it to Charles as a desire to be a more useful wife. Surprisingly, he agreed, perhaps thinking it a harmless occupation that would keep me busy and compliant. This gave me access to financial records and, occasionally, small amounts of cash I could secretly set aside. I cultivated a new persona, docile, grateful for Charles's generosity, seemingly content with my restricted life. I stopped resisting his advances, even feigned enjoyment sometimes, all while keeping my true self carefully hidden behind this mask of submission. The actor's skill I developed during those months would serve me well in later years, though I took no pleasure in the deception. Every smile, every dutiful, "Yes, Charles," was a step toward freedom, a move in a chess game where the stakes were my life and possibly my child's. Charles seemed pleased by what he saw as my transformation, rewarding my apparent submission with small freedoms, permission to walk the grounds unaccompanied, to visit the village shops, though always with Mr. Fleming driving me and reporting back. I used these opportunities to build relationships with people who might help me: the postmaster's wife, the bank clerk, the assistant at the solicitor's office. I would accidentally encounter them, strike up conversations, establish myself as a sympathetic figure. "Poor Mrs. Blackwood," they would whisper. "So young, so fragile after losing her baby." Their pity was useful. It made them willing to share gossip, to bend rules slightly, to answer questions that might otherwise seem suspicious coming from a woman of my position. Our third year of marriage brought an unexpected development. Charles began to show signs of illness. At first, just shortness of breath and fatigue. Then more serious episodes of chest pain that left him ashen-faced and terrified. The doctor diagnosed a heart condition, recommending rest and a careful diet. Charles raged against these restrictions, refused to moderate his habits or his work schedule. If anything, he became more controlling, more paranoid, as if sensing that time was running short. He began drinking heavily, especially in the evenings, sometimes becoming maudlin, other times dangerously violent. I learned to gauge his moods, to make myself scarce when the danger signs appeared. One night, during a particularly bad episode, he struck me with such force that I fell against the fireplace, cutting my forehead on the marble hearth. As blood trickled into my eye, something shifted within me. The last remnant of fear was replaced by a cold determination. I would not die here, not before finding my son. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. On a cold January evening in 1973, Charles was working late in his study. I had brought him his brandy as usual, then retired to my room at the opposite end of the house. Around midnight, I heard a commotion, shouting, running footsteps, the ringing of the bell that summoned the doctor. By the time I reached the study, Charles was lying on the floor, his face contorted in agony, clutching his chest. The doctor arrived quickly but could do nothing. Charles Blackwood, age 49, was dead of a massive heart attack. I stood in the doorway, watching as they covered his face with a sheet, feeling nothing but a vast, hollow relief. 3 years of captivity had ended in a moment, leaving me a 19-year-old widow, legally free for the first time since my forced marriage. Freedom, however, proved to be a complex and difficult thing. The reading of Charles' will brought the first shock. While he had left me a modest income, barely enough to live independently, the bulk of his estate went to a cousin in Edinburgh. Thornfield Manor, all its contents, and most of Charles's wealth would pass out of my hands within 6 months. The second shock came from the village itself. Rather than receiving sympathy as a young widow, I found myself subtly ostracized. The same people who had pitied poor Mrs. Blackwood now viewed me with suspicion. Rumors spread that I had been a cold wife, that I had driven Charles to his death with my demands, even whispers that I might have had a hand in his demise. The doctor who had witnessed my bruises, my deterioration under Charles's care, said nothing to defend me. Within weeks of becoming a widow, I discovered that I was as alone as I had ever been. I used the 6 months before I had to leave Thornfield Manor to search for information about my son. I combed through Charles' papers, bribed servants for any scrap of knowledge, visited orphanages in neighboring counties. All I discovered was that a male infant had been placed with a wealthy family up north, possibly in Yorkshire or even Scotland. The trail had been deliberately obscured, the records altered or destroyed. As the date of my departure from Thornfield approached, desperation set in. Where would I go? How would I continue my search with such limited resources? The small house in the village that had been set aside for me, as part of my widow's portion, seemed like another prison, one where I would be forever under the watchful eyes of people who had already judged and condemned me. One night, alone in the room where I had suffered so much, I made a decision. I would leave. Not just Thornfield, but the entire region. I would go to Dover, where ships departed daily for the continent. Perhaps in France or Belgium I could start anew, far from the whispers and the memories. I arrived in Dover on a grey March morning in 1973, the sea churning beneath chalk cliffs that seemed to echo my tumultuous thoughts. The modest sum I had managed to secure from my widow's portion would last perhaps 6 months if I was careful. I took a room in a small boarding house run by a no-nonsense widow who asked few questions beyond whether I could pay in advance. For 3 days, I wandered the harbor, watching ships come and go, trying to summon the courage to purchase a ticket to Calais. But something held me back. Perhaps the last threads of hope that I might somehow find my son if I remained in England. Perhaps simply fear of the unknown. On the fourth day, I walked to the edge of the famous white cliffs, staring down at the violent sea below. How easy it would be to step forward, to end the pain and uncertainty in one final act of desperation. I stood there for what seemed like hours, the wind whipping my hair, tears streaming down my face, poised between life and death. What happened next seems like divine intervention, though I've never been certain whether it was God or simply chance that saved me that day. A small voice, high and clear, cut through my dark thoughts. "Excuse me, lady. I've lost my kite." I turned to find a boy of about 5 standing behind me, red-cheeked from the wind, his expression a mixture of hope and worry. His innocence, his complete trust that an adult would help him rather than harm him, struck me with physical force. I stepped back from the edge, knelt down to his level. "Where did you last see it?" I asked, my voice rusty from days of silence. He pointed along the cliff edge toward a thorny bush where a bright blue kite had become entangled. Together we carefully retrieved it, his small hand trustingly in mine, as we navigated the uneven ground. When the kite was free, his face lit with such joy that something long frozen within me began to thaw. The boy's name was Timothy, and his mother came running up moments later, breathless with worry. Her relief at finding him safe quickly shifted to gratitude when she realized I had helped him. "You must let me thank you properly," she insisted. "We're having tea at the hotel down the road. Please join us." Something in her warmth, her genuine concern not just for her son, but for the sad-eyed stranger who had helped him, broke through my isolation. I found myself accepting, following them to the grand hotel where Timothy's father awaited. The Evans family, I learned over tea and scones, were visiting from London, where Professor Evans taught literature at the university. As Timothy proudly showed me how his kite was constructed, Mrs. Evans, Helen, quietly observed me. "You seem lost," she said finally, when her husband had taken Timothy to look at the ships through the hotel's telescope, not just here in Dover, but in a larger sense. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, perhaps the simple human kindness she offered without judgment, but I found myself telling her everything. My childhood in Devon, James, the forced marriage, the baby, taken from me, the years of abuse, my desperate search and final flight to Dover. Helen listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to deep compassion. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Eleanor," she said firmly, "what was done to you was monstrous, but you are not defined by it. You are young, intelligent, and stronger than you know. If you truly wish to find your son someday, you'll need resources, education, a position in society that gives you access and influence. Running away to the continent won't accomplish that. But perhaps we can help. My husband's department needs an administrative assistant. It's not glamorous work, but it would give you a foothold in London, away from the gossip of your village, but still in England. And in the evenings you could study. The university offers night classes for working adults." That chance encounter on the cliffs of Dover changed the course of my life. Within a week I had moved to London, taking a small bedsit near the university where Professor Evans had indeed secured me a position. The work was menial at first, filing, typing, making tea for academics who rarely noticed the quiet young widow in sensible clothes. But it was honest work, the first I had ever done, and it came with an unexpected benefit: access to the university library, a vast repository of knowledge I had never dreamed of exploring. With Helen's encouragement, I enrolled in evening classes, English literature at first, then history, psychology, eventually working toward a proper degree. The Evans family became my first real friends in this new life, inviting me for Sunday dinners, including me in family outings, offering the simple human connections I had been denied for so long. London in the early 1970s was a revelation after the confines of village life and Thornfield Manor. The city was changing, social barriers beginning to shift, opportunities opening for women that would have been unthinkable in my mother's generation. I changed too, shedding the persona of the timid, broken Mrs. Blackwood and rediscovering elements of the girl I had been before life had hardened me. I cut my hair short in the modern style, learned to wear trousers without feeling scandalous, developed opinions and found the courage to express them. The academic world, for all its stuffiness, accepted me based on my competence rather than my past. Few people asked personal questions, and those who did seemed satisfied with my careful explanation that I was a young widow establishing an independent life. The search for my son continued, but now it was methodical rather than frantic. Records requested through proper channels, contacts cultivated in social services, a small portion of each paycheck set aside for the investigation that I knew might take years. It was in the university library, 2 years into my London life, that I met William. I was researching for an essay on Victorian literature, completely absorbed in my work, when a soft voice interrupted. "Excuse me, but I believe that's my book." I looked up to find a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair at the temple standing beside my table. The book in question, a rare edition of Tennyson's poems, had indeed been set aside with his name card, though the library assistant had mistakenly given it to me. Our conversation that began with a polite dispute over a book turned into a discussion of poetry that lasted until the library closed. William Collins was a professor of English literature, 15 years my senior, recently returned from a teaching position at Oxford. Unlike most men I had encountered, he listened when I spoke, engaged with my ideas rather than dismissing them, seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences without any ulterior motive I could detect. Our friendship developed slowly over shared literary interests, cups of tea in the faculty lounge, occasional walks through Hyde Park, discussing books and ideas. William knew I was a widow but didn't press for details about my past, respecting my privacy in a way I found both unusual and deeply comforting. 6 months passed before he finally asked me to dinner, not at one of the fashionable restaurants, where I would have felt out of place, but at a small, quiet Italian place where the owner greeted him by name. Over pasta and wine that I barely touched, still unused to such luxuries, he told me his own story. His working-class childhood in Manchester, his scholarship to Cambridge that had opened the door to academic life, his brief marriage to a fellow student who had died of leukemia 10 years earlier. "Since then," he said, refilling my glass with the rich red wine I was slowly developing a taste for, "I've buried myself in books, safer than people I found, until recently." The way he looked at me as he said those last words made something long dormant stir within me. But I was still broken in ways he couldn't possibly understand, still haunted by the search for my son, still learning to trust after years of betrayal and abuse. When he walked me home that night, hesitating at my doorstep in a way that made his intentions clear, I found myself stepping back. "I'm not ready," I said simply. To my surprise and relief, he nodded, understanding without offense. "I have books to finish and classes to teach," he replied with a gentle smile. "I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor." It was the first time anyone had respected my boundaries, had seen me as something more than an object to be used or a problem to be managed. That night, alone in my small bedsit, I cried. Not from sadness, but from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being valued as a human being. Our relationship progressed with a patience and gentleness I had never experienced. William never pushed, never demanded, seemed content to let things unfold at my pace. When I finally told him the full truth about my past, a painful conversation that spanned several evenings and many cups of tea, his reaction was not the disgust or pity I had feared, but quiet anger on my behalf and profound respect for my survival. "You are the strongest person I've ever known," he said, taking my hand across the kitchen table in my tiny flat. "And I would be honored if you would consider sharing your life with mine." His proposal, when it came months later, was similarly lacking in drama or pressure. A simple question asked during a rainy afternoon at the British Museum, surrounded by ancient artifacts that had survived centuries of human turmoil. I said yes, surprising both of us perhaps, agreeing to a quiet registry office ceremony with just the Evans family as witnesses. Marriage to William was a revelation, a partnership of equals, built on mutual respect and genuine affection that gradually deepened into love. We found a modest house in Bloomsbury, walking distance to the university where we both now worked, I having completed my degree and secured a position as a research assistant in the history department. William supported my ongoing search for my son without question, contributing his own academic connections and resources to the effort. The trail remained frustratingly cold. Records from that time were poorly kept, deliberately obscured in my case, and the passing years had scattered potential witnesses. Yet I refused to abandon hope, setting aside one evening each week to write letters, make phone calls, follow up on the slimmest of leads. William would sit quietly reading in the same room during these sessions, offering tea and moral support, never suggesting I should move on or forget. Life developed a comfortable rhythm. Our work at the university, evenings spent reading aloud to each other or attending lectures and cultural events, weekends exploring London's museums and parks, or venturing further afield to the countryside. William's circle of academic friends gradually became mine as, well, intelligent, curious people who valued ideas and conversation above material wealth or social status. For the first time in my life, I felt truly at home, accepted for who I was, rather than judged for my past or valued only for my appearance or usefulness. Yet there remained an empty space in our family, one that became more apparent as friends and colleagues began having children. William, gentle as always, never mentioned it directly, but I sometimes caught him watching children in the park with a wistful expression that mirrored my own constant ache of loss. In the spring of 1978, when I was 25 and had been married to William for 2 years, a breakthrough finally came in my search. A retired nurse from Yorkshire responded to one of my many inquiries, remembering a private adoption arranged under unusual circumstances in early 1970. Her information led me to a solicitor in Leeds who reluctantly confirmed, after much persuasion and the strategic mention of potential legal action, that a male infant had indeed been placed with a family named Caldwell. Edward and Margaret Caldwell, wealthy industrialists, had adopted my son and named him James, a cruel coincidence that brought back painful memories of his biological father. The Caldwells had relocated to Canada in 1975, taking my 8-year-old son with them to Vancouver. After so many years of searching, to discover he was now across an ocean felt like both triumph and devastating setback. I spent that night alternating between tears and feverish planning, William steady beside me, helping me work through the practical implications of this new information. The trip to Vancouver stretched our modest academic salaries to the breaking point, but William insisted we find a way. "This is your son, Eleanor. Nothing is more important." We arrived in the Canadian summer of 1978, a city of mountains and ocean utterly unlike the England I had known all my life. Finding the Caldwells proved easier than expected. Edward was a prominent businessman, their address listed in the local directory. The house, when our taxi pulled up outside, was intimidatingly grand, a modern mansion overlooking the bay. Standing at the gates, I was seized with sudden doubt and fear. What right did I have to disrupt this child's life? He had been raised in wealth and privilege, with parents who had chosen him, while I was a stranger whose only claim was biology. Would my appearance cause him pain and confusion rather than healing? William held my hand tightly as we rang the bell, his presence giving me the courage to stand my ground when a suspicious housekeeper answered. Mrs. Caldwell received us in a sun-filled sitting room, decorated in expensive but tasteless ostentation. A thin, elegantly dressed woman with a perpetual expression of disdain. She listened to my carefully rehearsed explanation with growing alarm. "James is our son in every way that matters," she said coldly when I had finished. "This intrusion is not only unwelcome, but potentially damaging to a sensitive child. Edward and I have given him everything: the best schools, extensive travel, opportunities you could never provide. What could you possibly offer him except disruption and confusion?" Each word struck like a physical blow, all the more painful for containing elements of truth. I had come prepared for anger, for outright rejection, but not for this calculated dismantling of my maternal claim. Before I could formulate a response, the sitting room door opened, and a boy entered, tall for his age, with solemn eyes that widened in surprise at finding visitors. "James, darling, these people were just leaving," Mrs. Caldwell said quickly, moving to usher him back out. But the boy hesitated, his eyes locked with mine in a moment of connection that seemed to transcend the years of separation. He had my mother's straight nose, my father's firm chin, subtle echoes of a heritage he knew nothing about. The Caldwells had told him he was adopted, he would later tell me, but nothing of the circumstances. Looking at him, breathing the same air as my child for the first time since his birth, I found my voice. "We won't disturb your family," I said quietly to Mrs. Caldwell. "But I would like James to know that if he ever wishes to contact me when he's older, he can." I left my contact information despite her obvious reluctance, and as we were shown out, I glanced back to see the boy watching from the window, a puzzled expression on his face that would haunt my dreams for years to come. We returned to London subdued, the encounter with the Caldwells having opened wounds I thought had begun to heal. Yet beneath the pain was a profound sense of completion. I had seen my son, confirmed he was well cared for materially, if not emotionally, established a potential connection for the future. The knowledge was both bitter and sweet, requiring a different kind of patience than the desperate searching that had consumed me for so long. William, ever attuned to my emotional state, suggested that perhaps it was time to consider building our family in a different way. "There are children who need homes," he said gently one evening as we sat in our small garden. "Children without the advantages James has, who could benefit from the love we have to give." The idea took root slowly, germinating through long discussions and careful consideration of what we could realistically offer as older parents with modest means, but abundant love and stability. Naira came to us in the autumn of 1979, a serious 4-year-old with wary eyes and a history of neglect that had left her distrustful of adults and reluctant to speak. Her file was filled with phrases like "difficult to place" and behavioral challenges. Bureaucratic shorthand for a child the system had all but given up on. Our first meeting at the children's home was awkward, Sarah refusing to make eye contact or respond to our gentle questions. But as William quietly began building a house of cards on the table between them, her curiosity gradually overcame her wariness. When the structure collapsed, her startled laugh, the first the social worker had heard from her in months, sealed our determination to give this wounded child a home. The adoption process was lengthy and sometimes frustrating, but Sarah moved in with us before Christmas, bringing few possessions, but immense needs that would require all our patience, creativity, and love to address. The early months were challenging beyond anything we had anticipated. Sarah's trauma manifested in night terrors, hoarding food, explosive tantrums, and a deep-seated fear of abandonment that made even brief separations traumatic. There were moments when I questioned our decision, overwhelmed by the responsibility of healing wounds I hadn't inflicted and couldn't fully understand. But there were also breakthroughs. The first time Sarah reached for my hand without prompting, the morning I found her curled in William's lap as he read to her, the gradual extension of her vocabulary as she began to trust that her voice would be heard and respected in our home. By the following summer, the transformation was remarkable. She was still reserved with strangers, still prone to occasional outbursts when triggered by memories we could only guess at. But within our family circle, she had begun to flourish, revealing a sharp intelligence and quiet determination that reminded me, sometimes painfully, of myself at a similar age. Our family expanded again 2 years later with the addition of Thomas, Sarah's biological brother, who had been placed in a different foster home and whom she had mentioned with such longing that we immediately began the process of trying to reunite them. Thomas was 6, physically fragile from chronic asthma, but with a sunny disposition that had somehow survived multiple placements and separations. The siblings' reunion was one of the most profound moments of my life. Their wordless embrace, the way Sarah's perpetually tense shoulders relaxed for perhaps the first time since coming to us, Thomas's beaming smile as he explored his new home with his sister acting as proud guide. Watching them together, I felt a complex mixture of joy for the family we were building and renewed grief for the son still absent, now 12 and living his separate life across an ocean. I had written to James on each birthday, letters sent through the reluctant Caldwells, never knowing if they reached him or were quietly discarded. William's academic career flourished during these years. A prestigious departmental chairmanship, a well-received book on Dickens that introduced his ideas to a wider audience, invitations to lecture at universities throughout Britain, and occasionally abroad. My own work remained more modest but deeply satisfying, particularly after I shifted from pure research to developing educational programs for disadvantaged children, inspired by our experiences with Sarah and Thomas. Our home was busy, often chaotic, filled with children's projects, academic papers, the paraphernalia of 2 careers and 2 growing children with their distinct needs and interests. We were not wealthy by conventional standards. Academic salaries stretched to cover a London mortgage, the children's needs, and occasional modest holidays to the seaside. But we were rich in the things that mattered most: stability, purpose, love freely given and returned. Life settled into a new pattern, the search for James no longer consuming my days, but remaining a quiet undercurrent, an ongoing correspondence with the void. I continued sending birthday letters, added Christmas cards, and occasional updates on our growing family, always with the same invitation: when you're ready, if you're interested, we are here. The children knew about their older brother in Canada. I had been determined from the start to build our family on honesty rather than secrets, and sometimes included their own drawings or brief notes in my mailings. Sarah, in particular, seemed fascinated by this unknown sibling, perhaps recognizing in his absence a mirror of her own earlier separation from Thomas. "Do you think he looks like us?" she would ask sometimes, studying family photos with intense concentration. "Not physically," I would answer truthfully, "but perhaps in ways we can't see." These conversations were bittersweet, keeping hope alive while acknowledging the reality of our separated lives. As the 1980s progressed, bringing economic and political changes to Britain that sometimes seemed at odds with the values William and I held dear, our family unit provided a haven of stability and compassion. The children thrived, Sarah overcoming her early educational delays to reveal a remarkable aptitude for science and mathematics, Thomas developing into a talented artist despite ongoing health challenges that required careful management. We celebrated their achievements, supported their struggles, built traditions and memories that would sustain them through the inevitable difficulties life would bring. And through it all, I remained Eleanor Collins, no longer defined by trauma and loss, but shaped by it into someone stronger and more compassionate than I might otherwise have become. The young girl from Devon who had once stood at the edge of Dover's cliffs, contemplating oblivion, had found her way to a life of meaning and connection, though the journey had been far from straightforward. In the spring of 1988, as Margaret Thatcher secured her third term as Prime Minister, and Britain seemed increasingly divided between prosperity and struggle, a letter arrived with a Canadian postmark. Inside was a brief note in unfamiliar handwriting. "My name is James Caldwell. I believe you may be my biological mother. I'm planning to visit London this summer and would like to meet, if you're agreeable." The formal language couldn't mask the uncertainty behind the words, the tentative reaching across years and distance toward a connection both longed for and feared. I sat at the kitchen table, the single sheet of paper trembling in my hands, as William read over my shoulder, his arm steady around my waist. "He's coming home," I whispered, tears blurring the precious words I had waited 18 years to read. "At least to visit," William gently amended, always the pragmatist to balance my emotional nature. "But yes, love, your son is reaching out at last." The weeks leading up to James's visit were some of the most emotionally turbulent I had experienced since those dark days at Thornfield Manor. I alternated between excited anticipation and paralyzing fear. What if he didn't like me? What if he resented my intrusion into his life? What if the Caldwells had poisoned his mind against me with half-truths and distortions? William, as always, was my anchor during this storm of emotions. He reached out to you, Eleanor. He reminded me gently when I was spiraling into anxiety. That already shows tremendous courage and openness on his part. Sarah and Thomas, now 14 and 12 respectively, were nearly as nervous as I was about meeting their older brother, asking endless questions about what he might be like, what we should do with him, whether he would want to be part of our family. We prepared for his visit with almost comical thoroughness, deep cleaning the house, planning meals that might appeal to an 18-year-old's tastes, rehearsing conversations and preparing for awkward silences. James arrived on a rainy July afternoon, standing on our doorstep with a backpack slung over one shoulder, looking simultaneously older and younger than his 18 years. The resemblance to my father was even stronger now. The same square jaw, the same slight furrow between the brows when concentrating. But his eyes were softer, more open, lacking the hardness that had characterized Henry Hastings. Our initial greeting was awkward, formal handshakes giving way to a hesitant embrace that felt both strange and completely right. Inside, over tea that no one really drank, and biscuits that remained untouched, we began the delicate process of getting to know each other. James was reserved but not cold, asking thoughtful questions about my life, my search for him, the circumstances of his birth and adoption. I answered as honestly as I could, careful to present facts without casting blame, aware that the Caldwells, whatever their flaws, were the only parents he had known. "They told me I was adopted when I was 10, he explained, turning his teacup in precise quarter rotations on its saucer. "But they never mentioned you had been looking for me, or that your letters existed. I found them by accident last year, hidden in my father's desk when I was looking for my passport." The hurt in his voice was evident, not directed at me, but at the deception practiced by those he had trusted. "There were dozens of them, all unopened. Birthday cards, Christmas greetings, updates about your life. Years of reaching out that I never knew about." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "I confronted them. It didn't go well. That's partly why I'm here. Not just to meet you, but because I needed space to think about what this means for my relationship with them." The maturity in his assessment, the thoughtfulness with which he approached this complicated situation, filled me with a bittersweet pride for the young man he had become without my guidance. That first visit lasted 3 weeks, transforming from awkward politeness to genuine connection with each passing day. James bonded particularly well with William, the two sharing a love of literature and intellectual debate that often left them discussing some obscure poet long after dinner had ended. With Sarah and Thomas, the relationship developed more slowly, but no less meaningfully. Sarah approached her new brother with characteristic analytical caution, asking direct questions about his life in Canada, his education, his plans for university. Thomas, more emotionally open, simply invited James to help with his latest art project, a bridge of understanding built through shared activity rather than words. By the time James prepared to return to Vancouver, where he would begin university studies in the autumn, something profound had shifted. "I'd like to visit again at Christmas, if that's all right," he said as we stood at the departure gate at Heathrow. "And I'd like to write, properly write, not just formal notes." As we embraced goodbye, I whispered what I had been holding back, for fear of overwhelming him. "I have loved you every day of your life, even when we were apart." His eyes, suddenly bright with unshed tears, told me he understood. James did return that Christmas and the following summer, gradually becoming a regular presence in our family's life, despite the geographical distance. After completing his undergraduate degree in Vancouver, he made the momentous decision to pursue a master's degree in London, moving into a small flat near our home and becoming fully integrated into our daily lives. His relationship with the Caldwells remained complex and strained. They viewed his connection with me as a kind of betrayal, creating a painful divide that James navigated with more grace than I could have managed at his age. "They gave me many advantages," he would say when I expressed anger at their continued attempts to limit his contact with us. "But you gave me truth and the space to make my own choices. Both matter. This wisdom, this ability to hold complexity without simplistic judgment, became one of his defining characteristics as he matured into adulthood." The 1990s brought significant changes to our family. Sarah, brilliantly academic and fiercely independent, secured a place at Cambridge to study physics. Her childhood trauma transformed into a determination that impressed everyone who knew her story. Thomas, whose artistic talents had blossomed into a genuine gift, attended art school in London, his ongoing health issues managed but never entirely resolved. James completed his master's in economics, and after a brief return to Canada, in what I suspect was a final attempt to reconcile the different parts of his heritage, settled permanently in London, joining an international development organization that sent him to various countries implementing sustainable economic projects. William and I, now in our 50s and early 40s respectively, found ourselves unexpectedly in the empty nest phase of life. Our home quieter, but still the gathering point for family celebrations and regular Sunday dinners when all three of our children could attend. My professional life had evolved as well. What had begun as research assistance had developed into specialized work in educational psychology. My personal experiences with trauma and healing informing academic understanding in ways that traditional research alone could not accomplish. I completed a doctorate in my late 40s, focusing on resilience in children who had experienced early trauma, a subject I understood from both personal and parental perspectives. William, approaching retirement from his formal academic position, found renewed creative energy in writing for a broader audience, publishing several well-received books that translated complex literary theory into accessible insights. We were busier than ever, our careers reaching a kind of culmination, just as conventional wisdom suggested we should be slowing down. Life had taught me never to follow conventional paths, and in this, as in so many things, charting our own course brought unexpected rewards. The turn of the millennium, that strange, hopeful, anxious time when the world collectively held its breath in anticipation of change, marked another significant transition in our lives. William suffered a mild stroke in the spring of 2000, a frightening reminder of mortality that prompted us to reevaluate priorities. He recovered well but decided to fully retire from university teaching, focusing instead on the writing and reading that had always been his greatest joys. I scaled back my own work, arranging a part-time consultancy that allowed us more freedom to travel. Modest trips to Europe, a more ambitious journey to visit James in Kenya, where he was managing a promising microfinance project. We walked the beaches of Devon together, William using a cane now but still eager to explore, returning to the cliffs of my childhood with the perspective of decades lived fully and authentically. Standing where the bookshop had once been, now a trendy cafe catering to summer tourists, I felt the strange compression of time. The girl I had been and the woman I had become existing simultaneously in that space. Our children's lives continued to evolve in ways that filled us with pride tinged with the inevitable parental anxiety. Sarah's academic career took her to prestigious research positions in the United States and Switzerland before she returned to Britain as a professor in her own right, her personal life balanced by a long-term partnership with a fellow physicist who shared her commitment to gender equality in the sciences. Thomas found his voice as an artist whose work addressed environmental concerns, his exhibitions gaining recognition for their emotional depth and technical skill. His health remained a constant concern, the childhood asthma developing into more complex respiratory issues that required periodic hospitalizations. But he approached these challenges with a characteristic quiet courage that humbled me. James moved between continents, his work in economic development taking him to increasingly senior positions, where his natural diplomacy and cross-cultural understanding proved invaluable assets. He married in his mid-30s, a lovely ceremony, in London where the Caldwells and our family achieved a strained but functional truce for his sake, and within a few years made William and me grandparents to twins, a boy and girl whose mixed heritage reflected the increasingly interconnected world they would inhabit. William's health declined gradually over the next decade, the initial stroke followed by other small ones that incrementally diminished his physical capabilities while leaving his brilliant mind largely intact. I became his caregiver, a role I embraced out of profound love for the man who had shown me what real partnership could be. Our home adapted to accommodate a wheelchair, then a hospital bed in the downstairs study, but remained a place of intellectual engagement and emotional warmth. The children visited regularly. Grandchildren filled the house with noise and energy that William responded to even when other stimuli failed to register. In the quieter moments, I would read to him poetry, novels, the academic papers he could no longer easily focus on himself, his eyes following my movements, his hand squeezing mine to indicate particular passages that pleased him. When the end came in 2015, it was peaceful. William slipping away in his sleep after a day when all 3 children and several grandchildren had visited, the house full of conversation and laughter as it had been in our happiest times. Widowhood at 62 was not what I had planned, but life had taught me repeatedly that plans are merely suggestions, not guarantees. The grief was profound but not destructive, tempered by the absolute certainty that William and I had created something beautiful and lasting together, that no part of our shared life contained regrets or missed opportunities for connection. I remained in our Bloomsbury home, unable to imagine leaving the space we had filled with books, ideas, and family memories. The children worried about me being alone, but I assured them, and myself, that solitude was not the same as loneliness. My work, though reduced in scope, continued to provide intellectual stimulation and purpose. My involvement with several educational charities gave structure to my weeks, and most importantly, the family William and I had built together remained close-knit and supportive. Sunday dinners continuing whenever possible, holiday gatherings still centered in the home that had been our shared creation. At 72, I find myself in a place of reflection, looking back on a life that began in constraint and hardship, but opened into unexpected possibility and joy. The scars remain. There are still nights when I wake from dreams of Thornfield, Manor, when the ghost of Charles Blackwood's cruelty visits my subconscious. But these episodes are rare now, the power of those memories diminished by decades of healthier experiences. When I consider the alternative paths my life might have taken, had I not found the courage to search for my son, had I stepped forward rather than back on those Dover cliffs, had I not accepted the Evans family's outstretched hand, I am overcome with gratitude for the seemingly small choices that ultimately determined everything. Perhaps this is what wisdom consists of in the end, not grand revelations, but the accumulated understanding that life is shaped equally by circumstances beyond our control and the tiny momentous decisions about how to respond to them. My children and grandchildren urge me to write my memoirs, to document this journey from the vulnerable girl in Devon to the woman I am today. Perhaps someday I will, though the prospect of revisiting certain chapters remains daunting. For now, I am content to share these stories orally, especially with my granddaughters as they approach adulthood in a world still fraught with challenges for young women. They listen wide-eyed to my descriptions of life in the 1950s and 60s, the limitations placed on women's choices, the silence surrounding bodily autonomy and consent. "How did you bear it, grandmother?" my eldest granddaughter asked recently. "How did you not become bitter?" The question gave me pause, requiring honest introspection. I did become bitter for a time, I admitted. But bitterness is a poison that primarily harms its host. At some point, I recognized that moving forward required setting down that burden, not because those who harmed me deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved freedom from the weight of hatred. This philosophy, that healing is not about excusing harm, but about refusing to be defined by it, has become the cornerstone of my personal understanding of resilience. In my professional work with traumatized children, in my guidance to my own family, In my reflections on a life that has spanned decades of social change and personal transformation, this principle has proven both durable and liberating. We cannot choose many of our life circumstances, our origins, our early experiences, the historical moment into which we are born. But we can choose how we integrate these realities into our ongoing story. The girl I was at 16, pregnant and abandoned, could never have imagined the woman I would become. Not because the path was easy or direct, but because with each step, even the most painful ones, I moved toward a future that remained open to possibility, despite everything suggesting it should be closed. If you've been moved by my story, I encourage you to share it with others who might find echoes of their own struggles within it. Remember that behind every elderly person you encounter is a lifetime of experiences that have shaped them. Triumphs and tragedies, loves and losses, moments of courage and periods of despair. We all carry these stories within us, though not all of us have the opportunity to share them. Perhaps my journey from abandonment to wholeness will inspire you to look differently at your own challenges, to recognize that while pain may be inevitable, in any life fully lived, suffering need not have the final word. Please support channels like this one that provide a platform for these important narratives, stories that might otherwise remain untold. And if you're interested in learning more about resilience, about building strength from adversity, our ebook, Wisdom from Life's Challenges, offers additional perspectives from those who have navigated difficult paths with grace and determination. In closing, let me share what I consider the most precious insight from my 72 years. Love, in its many forms, remains the most powerful force for healing and transformation available to us. Not romantic love alone, though that can be beautiful, but the broader spectrum of human connection, the steadfast friendship of the Evans family that saved me at my lowest moment, the unconditional acceptance William offered that helped me rebuild trust, the complex but profound bonds with my children that taught me new dimensions of giving and receiving love. Even in our most isolated moments, possibilities for connection exist if we can summon the courage to reach for them. My life stands as testimony to this truth, that even from the deepest wounds, even after the most profound losses, the heart's capacity for renewal remains our most remarkable human gift.
Your journey with real stories continues right here on the channel. Click subscribe and watch the next amazing story on your screen right now.